The barn was quiet that night, its wooden beams creaking softly under the weight of years. A single lamp glowed inside, illuminating the figure of an old man lying on a bundle of hay. To anyone passing by, it looked like a picture of failure, a father so poor, so pitiful, that he had been reduced to sleeping in a barn while his children lived comfortably in the family's main house. But appearances can be deceiving. The old man, Jacob Turner, had a secret, one his children never bothered to uncover. They mocked him, laughed behind his back, and whispered that he was a burden, a relic too stubborn to sell his shabby farm. What they didn't know was that Jacob owned not just the land beneath their feet, but half the city they lived in. And one day, they were going to find out. It was Sunday evening, and the Turner family gathered at the long oak table inside the farmhouse dining room. Jacob sat quietly at the end of the table, his weathered hands folded neatly on his lap. His children, Michael, Sarah, and David, exchanged smug glances as they scrolled on their phones between bites of roasted chicken. "Dad, honestly," Michael said with a chuckle, "why don't you just admit you can't handle the main house anymore? Sleeping out in the barn like some farmhand? It's embarrassing." Sarah smirked, swirling her wine. "Yeah, people in town already think we're weird enough. Imagine if they knew our father prefers hay over a proper bed." David leaned back in his chair, laughing. "Maybe he's just trying to save on heating bills. Or maybe he's practicing for when we finally send him to a retirement home." Their laughter filled the room, echoing cruelly. Jacob didn't flinch. He lifted his fork, took a slow bite, and let their words wash over him. His silence only made his children laugh harder. They mistook his patience for weakness, and that was their greatest mistake. In his mind, Jacob thought back to the words of his late wife. Let them talk. One day, the truth will silence them. Jacob smiled faintly. "Eat well, children," he said calmly. "You'll need your strength for the days ahead." They rolled their eyes, dismissing him as nothing more than a tired, eccentric old man. None of them could imagine that the barn they mocked, and the man they underestimated, was the key to a legacy far greater than the mansion they lived in. Later that night, after enduring the laughter of his children, Jacob walked slowly out to the barn. The cool night air brushed against his face, and the crunch of gravel under his boots echoed in the silence. Inside, the barn smelled of hay, dust, and old wood, familiar, comforting scents. He lit a lantern and set it on a wooden crate near his cot. To his children, this barn was a symbol of poverty. To Jacob, it was something else entirely, a sanctuary, a vault of secrets. Against the far wall stood several locked chests and an old steel cabinet. Inside them were ledgers, deeds, and documents dating back decades. His children had no idea that while they laughed at him for choosing the barn, it was here that he had managed his real empire. Jacob sat on the edge of the cot, pulling out a thick folder. Inside were property deeds, apartment complexes, office buildings, parcels of land, all in his name. Quietly, he whispered to himself, "They think I'm a fool, but the fool is the one who doesn't see what's right in front of him." He tucked the folder back into the cabinet, locking it tight. Then, with a weary smile, he blew out the lantern and lay back. Tomorrow, the world would mock him again. But Jacob knew a day was coming when the truth would burn brighter than all their laughter. The following week, Sarah met some friends at a fancy cafe downtown. As they sipped their lattes and showed off designer handbags, the conversation turned, as it often did, to money and status. One of Sarah's friends leaned in and asked with a smirk, "So, is it true your dad's been sleeping in the barn? People are talking about it." Sarah forced a laugh, waving it off. "Oh, you have no idea. He's completely lost it. Honestly, sometimes I think he enjoys being pitiful. I mean, we live in a mansion, and he'd rather curl up in hay? It's embarrassing." The table erupted in laughter. Another friend shook her head. "Poor thing. At least you'll inherit the property one day and finally put it to good use." Sarah smiled smugly, but deep inside, a flicker of unease lingered. She had no idea how her father managed to keep the farm going all these years, especially when other farmers had sold their land to developers. But she quickly brushed the thought away. Meanwhile, in the corner of the cafe, an older man reading a newspaper glanced in their direction. He knew Jacob well and understood more than Sarah ever would. With a faint smile, he muttered under his breath, "They don't know who they're mocking." The long wooden dining table gleamed under the chandelier, but the atmosphere was anything but warm. Jacob sat at the head of the table, his posture calm, his plate half filled with roasted chicken and vegetables. His children, however, whispered among themselves, casting smirks in his direction. "Honestly, Dad," sneered Brian, the eldest, "you really expect us to believe you prefer the barn? With all the space in this house." His sister, Clara, laughed behind her wineglass. "Maybe he thinks he's still a farmer." "What's next, Dad?" "Sleeping in the chicken coop." Even little Emma, the youngest, giggled nervously, following the tone set by her older siblings. Jacob chewed slowly, his eyes steady, his silence deliberate. Inside, he felt the sting of their words, but he also knew something they didn't, something that would one day silence their laughter. When the mocking quieted down, he simply placed his fork on the table and said in his steady, deep voice, "Children, appearances deceive. One day you'll understand." The words lingered in the air like a riddle. His children rolled their eyes, mistaking wisdom for weakness. But in the barn, hidden beneath its dusty beams, lay secrets that would soon turn their scorn into awe. Years earlier, Jacob was not the man sitting at the head of a mansion table. He was a young farmer, with blistered hands and little more than a dream. The barn was his first refuge, the only roof he could afford. He raised chickens, grew corn, and saved every penny. The townsfolk laughed at him then, too. "Barn boy Jacob," they called him, "the man who'll never be more than dirt and hay." But Jacob's secret was persistence. He bought land others dismissed as worthless. He studied quietly at night, learning about property, leases, and city expansion. While others drank their wages, he invested his meager savings. Piece by piece, acre by acre, Jacob built what no one could see, a quiet empire. Back in the present, after his children had gone to bed, Jacob walked to the barn with a lantern in hand. He moved aside an old hay bale, lifted a loose floorboard, and pulled out a weathered chest. Inside were thick envelopes, deeds, property titles, and contracts. Each one bore his name, stamped and sealed. They weren't just pieces of paper, they were keys to half the city, shopping centers, apartment blocks, warehouses, and farmland stretching beyond what his children could imagine. Jacob ran his rough fingers over the documents. This barn wasn't just a shelter, it was the vault of his legacy. The next weekend, the family attended a charity gala. While sipping champagne, his children's friends noticed Jacob's plain clothes and whispered. His children laughed along. "Your dad sleeps in a barn, doesn't he?" one rich guest mocked. Brian smirked. "Yeah. He thinks he's some kind of country king. Don't ask me why." The crowd erupted in laughter. Jacob, standing at a distance, heard every word. His face remained calm, but his heart grew heavy. Still, he knew, time would unveil the truth. Later that night, Jacob overheard Clara on the phone with a friend. "I wish he'd sell the barn and stop embarrassing us. It's not like he owns anything important. All he's got is old hay." Jacob leaned against the doorway unseen. He didn't interrupt, didn't scold. He only sighed deeply. One day, his children would regret those words. A rumor spread in town. Jacob was going bankrupt. Some claimed the barn was falling apart. Others whispered that the mansion was mortgaged. His children panicked. "Dad, are we poor? Do we have to move?" Clara asked one night, her voice trembling with worry. Jacob smiled faintly. "No, child. We're far richer than you think." But he gave no details. His children exchanged confused glances, certain their father was hiding the truth. In the dead of night, under the barn's dim light, Jacob signed an agreement with city developers. They needed his land to expand a new business district. The deal alone was worth more than the mansion 10 times over. The papers slipped quietly into the chest. Another empire-building move, unseen by the very children who doubted him. Soon, trucks and surveyors began visiting the barn's land. His children grew curious. "What's going on, Dad? Why are there people outside?" Jacob only replied, "The barn has more life than you think." Their confusion grew, but they still didn't believe. The truth broke one Sunday morning. A news headline flashed across every screen. "Local farmer owns half the city, barn land to become multi-billion development." Jacob's name was printed boldly beneath it. Reporters swarmed the barn, calling him a visionary. Investors praised him as a silent genius. His children, once mocking, stood frozen in shock. The barn they despised was the crown jewel of an empire. That evening, Jacob gathered his children in the barn. The lantern light flickered across the old beams, now glowing with reverence instead of ridicule. He opened the chest, revealing the documents. His children gasped at the sight of their family's hidden fortune. "You laughed," Jacob said quietly, "because you could only see hay and wood. But this barn was where it all began. It is the foundation of everything we own." Tears filled their eyes. Emma whispered, "We're sorry, Dad." Jacob nodded. "I don't want your apology. I want you to learn. Wealth is not about mansions or appearances. It's about vision, patience, and sacrifice." The barn that once symbolized shame now stood as a monument to wisdom. His children finally understood, and as the sun set behind the barn's roof, Jacob smiled, because the greatest treasure he owned was no longer land or buildings. It was the lesson his children had finally learned.